Here is the timeline for today. You can see that we're still kind of right in the middle of the last millennium. And as I think I've already mentioned, things move pretty fast in the Greek culture. So it seems like we're not really moving that much, but things will change in a short amount of time. Here are some specific things we'll be looking at today. The discobolus, a vessel that they would drink wine out of called a Kylix, a Charioteer statue, and the Critias boy, which we will put in with the other choroi that we have looked at thus far, and that will help us to examine how things are changing in sculpture. Okay, so we're looking at the early classical period today, and we have three concepts that we're going to talk about: humanism, rationalism, and idealism. Humanism is a system of thought that attaches prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matters, and it stresses the potential value and goodness of human beings and seeks solely rational ways of solving human problems, which leads us to rationalism, which are opinions or actions that should be based on reason and knowledge rather than on religious belief or emotional response. And finally, idealism, which means you represent something as perfect or better than in reality. The early classical period also begins after a decisive victory over the Persians. And just to kind of give you a quick historical context, what happened was the Persians were upset that the Athenians participated in the Ionian revolt. Ionia was a part of Turkey ruled by the satraps. We have talked about them. But the people there were of Greek descent, so they decided to attack the Greek peninsula, the Persians. This led to the Battle of Marathon, where the Greeks defeated Darius. And this is the story of the runner that delivered the news to the Athenians and then died. And he was supposed to have run 26.2 miles, but it's believed he actually ran from Athens to Sparta to ask the Spartans to help out at Marathon. So after the Persians lost that, Xerxes decided to finish the job his father started, and this is where we get the Battle of Thermopylae, or the Battle of the 300 with Leonidas. In 481, the Persians sweep into northern Greece, they sack Athens, they burn the Acropolis, and the Athenians had evacuated except for a small contingent that remained on the Acropolis, and those people were defeated by the Persians. Then the Persians attempted to disable the Greek navies to maintain an advantage, and there is this battle of the Straits of Salamis, where their numbers become an actual disadvantage, and they're attacked by the allies while they're in disarray. The Greeks wiped out the majority of the Persian navy in the Battle of Salamis. In 479, there were a few more battles that gave Greeks simultaneous naval and army victories. And then Sparta abdicates from the allies, and this leaves the Athenians to spearhead what's called the Delian League. And the Delian League, which is an alliance of cities in the Greek peninsula, they defeat the Persians and free Thrace and other eastern Greek cities. Even after the victories, Athens is reluctant to give up control of the common treasury and requires the cities in the Delian League to remain, and it ends up basically subjugating these cities by the 450s. This means that the main freedom fighter becomes basically the conqueror. The Greek victory, I'm telling you all this because the Greek victory is seen as the victory of order over chaos. It's seen as order and rationality over Xerxes, who's portrayed as a man with no limits or self-control. So basically the Persian Wars are a justification of Greek culture, which is why it is very important to setting up the works of art that we're going to look at. So when I say that things move fast, what I'm saying to you is this is a span of 140 years in Greece, and you can see the move from a very stylistic statue in 620 to a much more naturalistic statue in 480. And we will talk specifically about that last one, the 480. That is the Critias boy. Hopefully what you'll be able to see is that the chorus figures of early classical seem to live and think, and they don't have that emotional remove of the archaic. As we saw in the east and west pediments of the temple at Aegina, Greek sculptors were moving towards more lifelike poses of their subjects, and this Critias boy is a prime example. This pose actually shows the beginning of Contrapposto, where you can see in the engaged left leg and the relaxed right leg. We will definitely discuss Contrapposto 1,000 times in this class. So if you don't understand it from this, we will get to it. The pose basically gives you alternate tension and relaxation. And then the statue has a slight turn of the head, which kind of invites the viewer to move around the figure. This is the first time that we've seen that, where it's not like a forward-facing thing. The early classical period sees Greek art embodying a more introspective and somber mood. So after the Persian War, the Athenians were starting to feel really good about themselves. They were actually a little hubristic. And if you don't know what hubris is, see Oedipus, which is the story of basically thinking that you are responsible for your fate instead of the gods, or that you are more powerful than a god. So the leader of Athens asked Critias, the same person that sculpted the last thing, to sculpt these two pre-Persian War lovers as a symbol of Athens' quest for democracy over tyranny. The story of this statue group is kind of hard to explain and a little convoluted. Basically, it's an assassination plot that goes wrong. However, they are heroes because they were attempting to overthrow a tyranny and replace it with a democracy, just like the Athenians did with the Persians. A lot of the Greek statues that we'll look at are bronze, and this Kylix has an image of how bronzes were made, and this is called the Foundry Painter, and it has this masterfully organized workshop scene within the flaring space that extends upward from the foot of the vessel and along its curving underside to the lip. They are engaging in a new hollow casting. So they make these statues that are hollow, and they use the lost wax process technique, and it allowed for more complex action poses in bronze. Most ancient bronzes were actually melted down for the sake of recycling material, but for some reason this work survives. This is known as the Charioteer, and it's from the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, which we talked about very early on. The youth's face is idealized, yet lifelike. It has onyx eyes. The realistic features of the figure's feet may have been cast from molds from the feet of a living person. And you can see how the cloth appears to be filleted like a column, sort of, if you think about the columns we've already looked at with the lines going down. This was not in the middle of a race, as the charioteer would have been racing, but after, and he's taking his victory lap, which is possibly why his pose is so rigid. And the setting of the work of the art affects the impression it makes. Today, the charioteer is exhibited on a low base and peaceful surroundings in a museum, and it's isolated from other works, and it's spotlighted for its close examination. However, its effects would have been very different in its original outdoor location. It would have been standing in a horse-drawn chariot atop a tall mountain, and viewers in ancient times would have been really tired from the steep climb to the sanctuary, and they would have been jostled by crowds and fellow pilgrims, and they could have absorbed its overall effect, not the fine details of the face, robe, and body that's visible to today's viewers. So today we can really get into it and take a look at it, but at the time, you might have just sort of seen it in its entirety and not really focused on those individual effects. Next, we have one of two warrior statues that were found off the coast of Italy. They're known as the Ryche Warriors. This is a bronze, and it reflects an idealized smoothness and harmony with realistic details. It has perfect proportions, and it contains minute details like swelling veins in the back of the hands. It has eyeballs of bone and glass, along with silver teeth and copper lips and nipples, and those add to the lifelike quality of the figure. His body exhibits a strong contrapposto stance, with his head turned to the right. Contrapposto basically means the weight is on, in this case, the right leg, and the stress is in the left arm, and the body has the contour of the letter S. So whenever you hear of contrapposto, basically it means the weight is on one leg and the stress is in the opposite arm, and usually there's a twisting or turning of the statue. This is known as the Artemisian Bronze. It was possibly Zeus or Poseidon. We're not sure because we don't know what he was throwing. We can see that he's concentrating and he's ready to throw, and it's either a lightning bolt or a trident, which gives you either Zeus or Poseidon. But what's interesting about this is that it demonstrates the utility and versatility of bronze. You can't do this with a marble statue because the arms would be too heavy and they would fall off. You would need some sort of support structure. But because bronze is light and it's strong, it can support this kind of a pose. There is a video in the modules about this statue, so please watch it when you get a chance. This is the disc thrower or discobolus. And I should say now that a lot of the statues that we look at in the Greek unit here are going to be Roman copies. A lot of them were either melted down because they were bronze, or just lost or broken because of the marble. So a lot of what we look at, if it looks like a complete sculpture, is often going to be a Roman copy. The Romans loved these Greek sculptures and they would copy them all the time and have them in their villas. So that being said, this is the disc thrower, and we are seeing this figure at the peak of his wind-up, where the motion is arrested for a brief instant before being unleashed. So it's like this pent-up energy. And early classical works tend to try to find this point of stillness that represents sort of all of the motion that someone would go through. This next thing is a Cicter. It looks like Cicter, but I'm pretty sure it's Cicter. It was made by Doris, who was a prolific early classical artist that has over 40 surviving pots, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it seems like it would be hard for these to survive anyway. Characteristic of his personal style are the curved W lines that mark the satyr's hips and the small arc that marks the lower boundary of the pectoral muscles. Cicters were wine coolers. They were made to float in a larger vessel called a crater that would be filled with cold water, and it was reserved for symposia, which is plural for symposium. So symposium or symposia were parties that were held in private homes where Greek males gathered to drink, eat, and sing together. Women were allowed, but only those from the prostitute class, and would serve as entertainment. Various topics would be discussed, like philosophy or poetry or politics or current events. And the activity was primarily enjoyed by the highest class of Greek society, and therefore it helps to reinforce the shared status of the elite. This specific Cicter is called the Frolicking Satyrs, and it was designed to make the satyrs seem to be walking in circles. Satyrs were the followers of the wine guide Dionysus, and thus an appropriate subject for a wine cooler. The ones shown here are performing various acrobatic feats involving wine cups. One wears the costume and carries the wand of the messenger god Hermes, and it has been suggested that the troupe may evoke the chorus of a satyr play with Hermes as the leader. And also at these symposia, they would do gymnastics or they would act out plays. So it wouldn't be so weird to also have this on the drinking vessels in which these things were happening. So they would need something to pour the wine into at these drinking parties, and these are what's called the Kylix, and they're basically a kind of a drinking bowl. And Doris made some of these as well, of course, and they have very lyrical compositions. The scene is usually only visible when the viewer would lift the cup to drink from it, and there were several meanings for the educated partygoer to understand. For example, all of these. I mean, you could look at some of these and see that they are erotically charged. Others are kind of funny. They were purposely designed with a stemmed foot and horizontal handles so that they could be easily lifted from the floor when reclining on a couch. They also did this thing where they played a game with these, with the seeds and skin and stems or other particles that would settle at the bottom of wine cups or jugs. And they would basically attempt to flick the lees, which is the name of all this detritus, into other cups. So they had a party game where they basically were flicking things into each other's cups. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. The next lecture will be mostly about the Acropolis, but we will look at more statuary.